Their Fated Travels. Chapter 23. The Skaven Attack. "150 years ago, the Celestial College. The Seer Council stared in horror and fascination at what they jointly foresaw would happen next to the group. Surely this would be the death of them. They all agreed. All except one, Seer Magister Viez. 150 years later, the present. They had left the cities of Middenheim and then later Altdorf behind them. They had presented only danger and mayhem. They were starting to feel collectively as if anywhere they might go would be fraught with risk to their safety, that somehow fate was trying to kill them. Little did they realize that in some ways fate was against them. There were, after all, powerful forces who were bound by contract of conditional payment of their deaths before they could get what they wanted, namely, more. Dieter privately wondered if Moore's agents would be seeking them out to speed up the process of the contract. He wouldn't have put it past them. They indeed concluded that fate had been waiting for them in ambush at Middenheim, and it was a wonder that no one ended up dead. Then they were drawn back to Altdorf again, where more problems had befallen them, but again they didn't realize that by leaving by a remote route now, by running from fate, they were heading into a danger far greater than anything they had faced so far. It was almost certain that Moore was watching their progress of what was coming. If Shalia was also observing their progress right about now, she would have been putting her hands across her face and saying, "I can't watch." "Oh, crap!" started Tobias, as he observed the carnage around them. Though he was only meant to be a formal observer to the party, things had changed a little when Maestro had been granted his full Magister's license. Tobias was now present on a semi-formal basis, present to record some great deed that the Supreme Lord Patriarch had foreseen to come. His rules of actual party relations engagement had been slackened somewhat now. After all, with each night time that arrived, his thief self had broken all of those rules anyway. He had developed an actual admiration for Maestro now. He couldn't believe that the wizard had come this far in so short a time. They had taken a coach south from the city and had ridden them quite quickly through much of the nearby forest, not far from the forest's edge. Their destination was Nuln, the once capital of the Empire, the place where Rysandria had been born. It was time for her to visit that place once more. Maestro had agreed to go too, because it meant the tricky matter of him taking on an apprentice wouldn't come about if he wasn't around in the college. Their driver had received word from military sources that roaming bands of beast men had been seen on the roads that led directly southeasterly towards Nuln. The driver had therefore decided to press directly south instead, and when he had gone suitably far enough off of the orthodox route, he would cut directly east instead. Of course, this made him happy as well, because it meant the fare would be higher too. The coach had rolled over a bump in the road, which had turned out to be the body of an Empire soldier. His uniform was too badly torn, his body and armour too disfigured to ascertain the livery's origin. They had ridden on only to come upon a section of the road that was covered in bodies. The further along the road they went, the more bodies they saw. They could tell from what little was left of the heavily disfigured men that they were mixed units from a number of different armed companies around the Empire. Tobias reminded the group that he had heard of some soldiers being posted as a guard on areas of importance, even as far south as this. There was always the risk of a regrouped invasion forming, and these men were the rear guard in place in case it did. They were out of Middenland now, but even Reichland's northern side had become destabilized from the war. In fact, one of the biggest threats to the area was the fearful people. When people were scared, they did silly things. They would get paranoid with each other, unable to discern enemy from friend. These soldiers were also dealing with such problems as these. The coach simply had to stop, because the amount of bodies in the way made it impossible to pass. They would now have the unpleasant job of moving them out of the way first. The coach driver Samuel was already regretting accepting a job from the so-called heroes of Middenheim and Altdorf. He told his manager that it would probably mean trouble for him, seeing as how much trouble they had gotten themselves into during just their short visit alone. The manager had been unsympathetic to Samuel's concerns. He knew that his manager didn't like him anyway. That was probably why he'd been assigned to the task of transporting this seemingly ill-fated group. If there had been some sort of old-world transporters union, then they might have passed a collective law banning the group from travel. Lucky for them, there wasn't.
"What could have done this, I wonder? Gosh, I hope we're not in danger," speculated Maestro.
Rysandria was a little disturbed by the wizard's unfeeling tone. It wasn't just this time, she considered. Maestro would often react to atrocious things far more casually than she would expect a wizard to. After all, he wasn't used to being up to his elbows in enemy intestines like Tordrad or Dieter were, yet he was so blasé about things that would surprise the other two. She noticed that Maestro had no reaction to the scared orphans they had met on their way to Middenheim. He had felt nothing of their companions' deaths along the way, those such as Father Odo. She had noticed Maestro's lack of emotional regard for so many things except his own safety. She wondered if he might perhaps have some sort of sociopathic tendencies or an undiagnosed disorder. It wouldn't be too hard to imagine. Most wizards had something wrong with them. She had noticed. She could recall at least twice having to lay her hands upon the man's head and recite calming blessings when his spells had backlashed badly on him, like a gust catching a match's flame and burning one's fingers, but on a far greater level, threatening his very sanity perhaps. Then there was his discomfort around women as well. He did indeed have a number of unresolved issues, she determined thoughtfully. Perhaps a beast man attack, wondered Dieter aloud. Tobias neutrally replied,
"That is unlikely, Death."
"Death," corrected Dieter angrily, "and if you keep calling me that, I'll end up tying your tongue around a tree branch until you say it right." Rysandria noticed how Dieter carried his darkness on his sleeve, but the more she tried to think about it, the harder it was for her to concentrate. That bothered her too. Tobias continued in his snobbish manner.
"These people have been eaten, right here and now. Beastmen would at least take them to their camp and consume them there."
With that, the halfling wiped his sweating forehead stressfully, knowing that he was perhaps close to extreme danger. As always, the halfling in the daytime had a good temper for taking threats from Dieter. His nighttime self was a little more impatient, however. Rysandria considered Tobias's mental state each night. This perhaps concerned her more than any of the others. She saw it as her duty to get to the bottom of his problem too. Dieter shrugged. Perhaps they were starved followers of Khorne, who didn't just stop at a blood fix. Rysandria formed the mark of Shalia in the air at the mention of Khorne. Tordrad slightly squinted his left eye and curled his lip on that same side, whilst looking at the state of the bodies around them. His keenly honed battle senses warned him that here had been the site of a great battle. "We are all in great danger standing here, fools," he said in his Kislevite tongue, and gave up trying to make them understand.
"Besides," continued Tobias, "you'll notice the bones have not been cracked to get at the marrow as beastmen or orcs would do. Something has feasted, but in a hurry."
Only Tordrad and Dieter did not hold their noses from the stench of decay around them. The coach driver went as far as to vomit for a third time just to attest to the horrific surroundings that faced them. 14 minutes later they had moved all of the bodies aside. The coach driver rode on with a handkerchief still firmly across his face like a bandit might were he to rob this very coach. They continued on the road, still passing bodies as they went, but they were more thinly spaced around them. In some cases they were thinly spaced because their limbs were apart from their torsos, but still they had all one visual factor in common. They had all been grossly mutilated in some way. Many were stripped to the bone. Within seconds, the road took a steep uphill slant. They could see the presence of more bodies at the top, and the fearful feeling inside them, the terrible consideration of dread at how bad a mistake coming this way had been, finally dawned on them. A live soldier dragged himself to the top of the hill from the far side. His legs were missing from the knee down on his right, and from the upper thigh on his left. He began rolling downhill. Maestro noted that it seemed almost comical, like the various slapstick plays that he'd seen in his youth, but decided that he had better not say so publicly. The coach halted at the bottom of the hill so as to not run him over. As the party hurriedly got out, ready to rush towards him in a gesture of futility, the grievously wounded man reached a desperate bloodied hand towards them, bringing up red foam from his mouth as he did so, then collapsed completely, face down. Rysandria's face turned to stone, a permanent frown of mental grieving, as if he had been a relation to her. At that moment in time, Tobias reckoned that she looked every bit like the mournful statues of Shalia herself. The truth was that those of the Shalian order were more outward with their feelings. They were more emotional over the suffering of innocence. As Rysandria put her 2 palms to the man's chest, Dieter asked, "Can you save him?" Rysandria responded, "Were I to revive him somehow, he would only suffer a few moments more before dying again, perhaps more painfully this time." Her face contorted in sorrow. It worsened as Dieter spoke. "His pain is of little importance. He can tell us what happened here." Rysandria looked at Dieter in horror. Momentarily, her eyes regarded him as if he were the ever-chosen of chaos standing in front of her at that moment in time, or perhaps some sort of terrible demon. As her mind started to race, his smile somehow then had a calming effect on her, and she started to forget how the original thought had come about. She thought more logically about it for a moment, and replied when Dieter impatiently gestured with his hand for a required answer. Rysandria stated, "He has passed too far through the gates of death. For me to interfere now would be an affront to Moore himself. I would not seek to upset the higher powers." Dieter's face flushed with embarrassment at this comment. "Relax," he told himself. "She doesn't know what you've done." But he let the issue go as it was with a respectful bow of his head. Olga smelled a patch of blood on the ground and lapped at it wistfully. Tobias looked at the dog and thought to himself how there seemed to be something wrong with it, some darkness about it somehow. As the group reached the top of the hill on foot, and the coach driver staggered along a few paces behind them, huffing and puffing as he went, they saw new carnage that made the previous find look tame. Before them now was the sight of the true battle, it seemed. This time there were so many bodies in the way that stretched further up the road that trying to clear the blockage might keep them here until nightfall. As the coach driver, Samuel, reached the top of the hill beside them, he stared for a second, his eyes bulged, and he gagged, raising a finger to the others to indicate that his vomit had been a false alarm, that he was on top of the situation. Suddenly he threw up.